shows that the symbols and the legends not only are similar, but in some cases identical. And so the theory would be that when Atlantis went under, the civilization, in terms of its culture, survived in these outposts. And then, of course, there are other people who argue that there are groups in China where the rings and the evidence indicates that there was settlement there. So the evidence is very persuasive that there have been various civilizations from other galaxies who have come to planet Earth and who have settled or colonized areas of the planet. And of course, some people argue that that was done deliberately to see how the red race, the black race, the white race, the brown race, the yellow race would survive and whether they could work together. And that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it, but that's what we're working on apparently at this time in our human history.
So, Leo, what interesting new cases are going on right now?
A lot of people I work with, some from Colorado, and some of these people don't want me to talk about their experience until they feel that they have a better handle on it. This next few weeks I'll be working with some people who are not only describing a variety of encounters, a variety of experiences with various ETs, but they feel like it's been an ongoing thing not only for them but their family. Stan Romanek is one who's getting a lot of attention now because he and his wife are not only willing to talk about their experiences, but he's had a couple of books. She's got a book called The Other Side of the Bed. I haven't read it yet, but that sounds interesting. What does the wife or the husband of the person who's describing these experiences, how does he or she deal with it? Stan grew up in a family of brothers and sisters, and a father who is in the Air Force and who apparently was involved in some of the military cover-up. And when he started seeing objects, well, he was the kind of guy who would take a camera and record the flying saucer sightings. And then later on, he began to have direct encounters. He went through hypnosis sessions with Deborah Lindemann. One session I got a kick out of when I read about it. He was talking with her, and during the hypnosis session, felt like E.T. spoke through him and worked and came up with a formula. And people who looked at it said that's the Drake formula. The Drake formula has to do with a physicist who estimated the possible number of galaxies, the possible number of solar systems, the possible number of planets, the possible number of planets with life, the possible number of planets with intelligent life, and then comes up with a figure that varies depending on what the estimates are in the other parts. And so what Stan did was he wrote that formula, and then he came up with a number, and he wrote down below times 100. And I got a kick out of that. Of course, the skeptics said, well, he could have memorized the Drake formula, and that's why he came up with it in the hypnosis session, which is, of course, a possibility. Stan is very bright. Although he's dyslexic and he doesn't learn in quite the same way that other people learn, well, he decided to see if hypnosis with Leo would be helpful, and so we made those arrangements through some friends. And after several sessions, not only did he describe his memory on board, talking with the ETs, but also he began to channel information or allow an ET to speak through him, and now there'll be a movie coming out this year that will show some of those kinds of things in some of the interview. So the books, the movies, the photographs, He's had all kinds of evidence, just like a lot of people have all kinds of evidence, but he's been willing to record it. Just for example, I got a message on my phone in Laramie, and I took a recorder and recorded it and then took the message down to Colorado when we had a meeting. There were other people who had got messages. The messages seem to come from a voice that sounds feminine, sounds metallic or computerized, got an English accent.
Right.
And
yeah.
And that kind of evidence is interesting to people who say, well, these other stories that Leo tells or that his clients tell, they could be made up or they could be hoaxed and so forth. But if something is recorded and then can't find where the recording came from on the telephone directory, those kind of things intrigue people. Plus the fact that when some of the sessions are videotaped, Stan comes up with a formula that are partly what's known to physicists and with information that seems to go beyond current physical knowledge. That's intriguing to people, no matter where it comes from. So Dr. Claude Swanson, a physicist, has talked with Stan, and Dr. Jack Kasher, a physicist from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He's talked and gone over the material. So that kind of evidence is impressive to some people who otherwise just think it's another story.
You know, recently, well, it's been a few months, Paul and I went up to the Navajo reservation. We talked to some friends up there, and the daughter of the family we were talking to, she's in her 20s, works in Flagstaff somewhere. Uh-huh. She was coming home describing a red orb that was flying alongside her car on the way home. And then later, as she pulled into the driveway to where she was going to park her car, there was a 3-foot or so rabbit, what looked like a rabbit sitting on its hind legs. Mm-hmm. Very big, and with his long ears draped backwards. Now, if you go up on the Navajo reservation, there's something called the Jackrabbit Trading Post, and that same image is on the buildings of those trading posts. The interesting thing is this is not a natural phenomenon, and she was more or less frozen. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. And I have an idea what that might be all about, but I wanted to hear what you have to say about something like that. When we're seeing something that looks to us like something else, but it could be something entirely different.
Yeah, Bud Hopkins and others have studied this phenomenon. They use the term screen memory to refer to a large owl or deer. That seems to be unusual. I've talked with people who have described both memory-wise as well as during hypnosis that they encounter owl that behaves strangely and maybe communicates with them, and then later they feel like that the screen memory was actually of an ET. Or people who describe a deceased relative who talking with them or a family member. To me, there are two components. One is to get the person's attention and then to puzzle a person. So getting the attention, the person says, this is unusual. And then being puzzled by what does it mean. They can't let go of the image, or they can't let go of the conversation or of the memory because it grabs them. And it's, some people can wake up in the morning and they say, oh, that was just a bad dream, and they dismiss it.
Right.
But these people say to themselves, this is unusual, I've got to figure it out. So they start reading, and maybe they'll go read about ancient history or read about Native Americans. One young man, he came over from Cheyenne years ago to talk with me, and he said, I don't understand Sprinkle. He says, why am I going to uninteresting conferences? Why am I reading uninteresting stuff? he was kind of pissed about what was going on, and he said, what's going on? I said, well, maybe this has to do with the UFO experience. He said, I've never had a UFO experience. I said, well, maybe maybe you don't remember childhood, or maybe it's a past life, or whatever. I said, shall we try hypnosis? Okay. So we do some hypnotic procedures, and he goes back to age 15 and 10 and 5, and there's nothing there. And I said, what's your attitude about reincarnation? He said, I don't know. Maybe so. So I said, okay. I said, just hold in your mind this feeling that you're supposed to know something or learn something and see what happens. And so he started describing himself as a young man, Native American, crawling along the kind of a prairie with sagebrush and so forth, and looking up in the sky and seeing this light. The light seems to get bigger and brighter, and it gets closer, and he sees it as an object. Then he claims the object during the trance state. He claims that the object hovers, and the door opens, and he feels impelled to go inside. And so he goes inside, and he sits there, and he's listening and talking with this little creature, this little guy, like a gray, whatever. And the guy tells him that you won't remember this until another lifetime when you're a white man. And in the trance state, he said, "White man? Who wants to be a white man?" Well, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. So he began to realize that this was an ongoing experience, and it had to do with his love of nature, love of animals, and so that in this lifetime he feels that he's not so much interested in the UFO thing, he's more interested in protecting the planet.
And that happens to so many of us, I think.
Yes.
I want you to, how is this, what we just talked about with the objects that we perceive as, like you said, owls or rabbits, or is that in any way similar to the skinwalker experience that the Native Americans talk about?
I think so. Although, if my understanding is correct about the skinwalker, that's a means of communication, and the various animal forms are messengers. For some people I work with, that's true, but also for some people I work with, they go back to a past life experience where that is significant to them, and whether it has to do with animals or people or whatever. One example of that kind of experience, I was talking with a man and a young lad. They lived in Casper, but they had told me that after one of their sightings, they had gone to another state, and they had come back. And as we talked about it, we talked about the physical experiences that they had, the UFOs. They were noticing something that was unusual. The father said that when they were looking at the Casper Mountain, he looked up there and he saw some lights and some objects at night. The boy said he saw some objects. The boy described 4 lights. The father described 5. I questioned him about that later on, and the father said, well, that's interesting. He said, because the lights were up, and then they would dip down, and then they went up again. He said, when we left Casper, went to Florida, our financial situation went up again. We came back, and he said at that time my wife was pregnant, and the boy didn't know that. So from the father's standpoint, there were 5 members of the family. From the boy's standpoint, there were 4 members of the family. So to me, it's important for a person not only to describe the experience, but also to have some understanding about what's going on in the person's life and how that UFO experience or the ET encounter might relate to what's going on in the person's life.
We're coming up on 3/4 of the hour, so we're going to take a break right here where we left off. We're going to be wrapping this up with Dr. Leo Sprinkle. We'll come back and do some question and answers. The call-in number is 888-919-27 888-919-2355. Again, that's 888-919-2355. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Epic Voyagers Inception Radio. I'm your host, Christine Dickey, State Director for Epic Voyagers, Arizona. We are speaking with Dr. Leo Sprinkle from the University of Wyoming, formerly. Dr. Sprinkle is now in private practice in his hometown of Laramie. We're going to finish up for a few more minutes here before we take question and answers. By the way, listeners, you can join us on the live chat room at Inception Radio Network. Just click on live chat. Our call-in number for questions is 1-888-919-2355. Welcome back, Leo. Thank you, Christine. Now, here's a question Paul has for you. He, as you know, Paul was a intelligence research analyst in Washington, D.C. for many years before moving to Arizona. And during the 1960s, during the UFO flyover over Washington, D.C., I was during the Johnson administration. After Paul had witnessed, along with others, the UFOs flying over the White House and the Pentagon, he was home with his ex-wife, and the children were still quite young then. And all of a sudden, he's sitting there in the chair trying to relax as much as he could, and heard a voice. And the voice said, "Paul." And male, very masculine male voice. He turned around, looked around, couldn't see anything. Went back to reading the newspaper, and the voice said again, "Paul." He said, "Go over to the closet, get your binoculars. There's a UFO outside." Now, this is as clear as a bell. I mean, this, just like, he said it was a booming male voice. And he grabbed his binoculars. He went to the front door. It's pouring rain, just absolutely a downpour. And he thought, well, let's get this over with. And he starts to step out, and the rain stops immediately. Wow. He goes outside, and he looks around. They're living in apartments in Virginia, I believe, weren't you then? And there were all the little kids, and the parents were inside eating their dinners and stuff. And Paul's looking around. He doesn't see anything. Turns around to go back into his apartment and looks up. And there's a hole, huge hole in the cloud. And a UFO, like a cat's eye, sitting right in the middle of the cloud. Now, of course, he calls out all the women and children and parents and a whole crowd of people. He passed around the binoculars. They all got to see the UFO for several minutes before it disappeared. Now, how do you think they're communicating that way? Are they beaming a frequency to our brain, or what? That happened.
Thanks, Paul, for a good question. Yeah, it reminds me of the Chicago O'Hare Airport scene where a flying saucer comes down the day and then flies up and pokes a hole in the clouds. Many people saw it, but the officials didn't report it. I'm glad that Paul talked to other people and asked them to speak. It may be much more than this, but at least it represents to me another example, an excellent example, not only of the phenomenon, the flying saucer, the the rain and then the no rain, but also the message. To me, over and over, this seems to indicate that not only can flying saucers exhibit unusual maneuvers, but that the ETs, star people who are piloting these craft, have amazing abilities for communication. But even more than that, it says to me that it's a wake-up call. And that's what I feel is so important for us humans to recognize that the planet is going through some difficult times, the global economy is going through difficult times. We all are being a part of the human transformation. So I'm hoping that I'm speaking in response to the question. I think, yeah, that's a great example of not only the phenomenon, but the message behind the experience.
I find that with my own experience over the years, that being an investigator, and you listen to so many stories out there. Some of them not always true, some of them very true. And after a while, you get a good feeling for what is and what isn't. But still, even though you have doubts about someone's story, you have to let them talk about it, let them voice that experience in their head. If nothing else, maybe it's something they need to relive or feel or get out or something. I don't know.
Yeah, Richard Dolan's book, or 3 volumes, UFOs and the National Security State. I like his view that not only are we, the people, responsible for talking about our experiences, but also we don't have to be angry unless we want to be, and we don't have to be vindictive against the government and military people who are part of the cover-up, because they too have their concerns. And so it's almost like the phenomenon. I remember J. Allen Hynek saying to me one time when I was talking with him, he was getting ready to take his flight out, and he said, the UFO phenomenon doesn't need a government grant. It just keeps on moving. And that's true, that we can be concerned about our own individual experience, and that's good. And we can talk about it, and that's good. But also, I hope that we can create a climate in which everybody, as you said, can talk about their experience, and then the military and the governmental people can recognize that they kept the secret for many years, not out of malice, but out of concern in terms of patriotism or whatever.
Right.
So I don't know how it's going to work out, but I'm hoping that the disclosure comes soon. Many governments have been giving up their secrets now. If China and Russia and the U.S., they're the big 3 according to some people, maybe we're ready for disclosure at that level.
I don't think there'll be disclosure. I think they'll just come down and land and won't be need for disclosure.
That'll happen. That'll do it. Could be.
Oh, I had a question here and it kind of escaped my head here for a minute. But, when people, I kind of lost my train of thought. So I guess, Leo,
well, let me mention.
Take it over.
Let me mention a man who came to Laramie years ago. He now lives in another state, but he was concerned because as a child he lived in Germany, and he was Boy Scout and military family, and yet he knew that they had some secret meetings, and then later on he was involved in mind control and space-time travel. And every time he started talking about his experiences, he would become suicidal. It was almost as if he was programmed to not talk about those experiences. I've worked with some family members, who felt like their father or their brother died as a result of being too inquisitive about the military stuff. So there are a lot of difficult experiences that families have had, and I'm hoping that the climate for disclosure will increase so that people feel not only able to talk about their experience, but help other people who they know to talk about their experiences.
Okay, caller, listeners, we would like, if you would like to speak with Dr. Leo Sprinkle, our number is 1-888-919-0009. 888-778-2355. You could also visit the Inception Radio Network live chat room. Just click on live chat and ask a question on the chat room. One thing I wanted to say, it finally came back to me, is I hear from so many people who say they've never seen a UFO, they've never experienced a UFO, they've never had any kind of an experience like that. Why do I have them all the time? Why does my husband have them? Why does Stan Romanek have them?
Yeah, that's a good question. My own guess is that we planned that coming into this lifetime. So if someone says to me, well, Leo, how can I have experience? I say, well, if I go downtown and I say, I sure want a shirt, well, all of the people who have shirts, they'll say, well, that's nice. But if I say I've got $30 and I want a shirt, well, then they start paying attention. So if a person wants to have an experience, but I say be careful because you may get more than you want. But if you want to have an experience, then meditate, pray, and say, I'll do something for you guys, you do something for me. I talked to one man, he was at a conference, and he said, Leo, he said, I've never had a UFO experience. And I told him, I said, well, there are two ways of having it. One is to go out someplace where there are a lot of sightings being reported, and you keep watching, and night after night you'll get a sighting. He said, I've tried that, and it didn't work. I said, well, the other method is to send up a message saying, I'd like to have a sighting, and I'll do something for you. And he said, I tried that, and that didn't work. And I said, that didn't work? I said, I've never heard of that method not working. Are you sure you haven't had a UFO sighting? He said, nah. I said, or something that might have been a UFO sighting? Well, then he got quiet, and he came in. He didn't want anybody to listen. He said, well, you know, my buddy and I, we were out in the woods, and this one night we looked up in the sky, and we saw this satellite go over, and he pointed east and west. And then he said, right after that, another satellite came over north and south. I said, east and west, north and south? Yeah. I said, that sounds strange to me. He said, yeah, that is strange. I said, are you sure? He said, what do you think that was? I said, maybe he had a case of misidentified UFOs. And he thought, well, okay, maybe he was having experience. So whenever a skeptic says to me, there's nothing to it, I say, well, read 1,000 reports, talk to 100 people, have your own experience, and then let's talk.